The New Orleans Saints offensive coordinator search just got a lot tougher. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation? I am your host, Ross Jackson, your New Orleans Saints expert, credentialed media member covering the New Orleans Saints as a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're going to be taking a look at whether or not the New Orleans Saints should add more names to their offensive coordinator search and what those names could be. We're going to introduce you to some of the new coaches that have now landed in the NFC South and what they mean for New Orleans. And we're going to kick everything off with the fact that the New Orleans Saints offensive coordinator search just got a lot tougher. Appreciate you very much for being an everydayer here on the Locked On Saints podcast and making us your first listen of the day every day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers are going to get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place any $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started today. Yes, the New Orleans Saints offensive coordinator search just got a lot tougher, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the New Orleans Saints should act fast because there might not be a lot they can do about it. So the Panthers, as well as the Atlanta Falcons, have now hired their head coaches all in one day on Thursday. The Panthers hire away the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offensive coordinator and Dave Canales to be their head coach. The Atlanta Falcons, they bring Los Angeles Rams defensive coordinator Raheem Morris, who is also a former staff member of the Atlanta Falcons, former head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers back a few years ago, 2010-ish, some range of years during that time. So they add a defensive head coach, meaning that they're going to be looking for an offensive play caller. And because of the fact that the Carolina Panthers hired the Bucs offensive coordinator, the Bucs, who already have a defensive head coach, are going to be looking for an offensive play caller as their offensive coordinator as well. Rutrow. So that means now that the Saints, the Bucs, and the Falcons are all going to be looking for not only offensive coordinators, but play callers, in particular, play calling OCs. And the Falcons now are probably likely to land one of the Saints' top candidates and one of the top candidates around the NFL at offensive coordinator, my number one candidate for the Saints OC job, in Zac Robinson. Why? Because Zac Robinson and Raheem Morris were just working together over in the City of Angels, Los Angeles, with the Los Angeles Rams. Raheem Morris comes over as the Los Angeles Rams defensive coordinator. Zac Robinson, the quarterback coach, passing game coordinator for the same Los Angeles Rams. And as we know in the NFL, and certainly we see it here in New Orleans all the time, previous relationships go a long way. So for the Saints, this potentially means that one of their top candidates could be off the board, and there's nothing that they can do about it. Because look, if Zac Robinson knew that this would be a potential to continue on with his friend Raheem Morris, who he knew was interviewing for head coaching jobs, who Raheem Morris was probably telling, hey, if I get this head coaching job, I'm taking you with me. If that was the case, Zac Robinson wasn't going to say yes to any jobs until he saw where his good friend Raheem Morris ended up. So even if the New Orleans Saints made him an offer, there's no shot that he would have said yes until he knew what was going on. Again, previous relationships rule the NFL. We see it year after year after year after year. So things could get ugly for New Orleans, even though they have absolutely no control over it. And I understand, look, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to say, well, if the Saints would have hurried and hired somebody more quickly, if they would have hired Zac Robinson right away, then everything would be good. But it's not just hiring Zac Robinson. Zac Robinson has to say yes, too. You don't just go and pluck somebody up and say, okay, you're the offensive coordinator now. And again, like I mentioned, he knew that Raheem Morris was interviewing for opportunities. He knew that he could potentially go somewhere and land a job with a friend, meaning that he would be locked in and safe for as long as that friend is there. This happens in the league all the time, unless he made the decision to leave. Now, the one thing that you look at the New Orleans Saints and go, okay, well, maybe there's a quicker path to being a head coach by going to the New Orleans Saints. You don't have the previous existing relationship that you would have to sever, or not sever, but that you would potentially impact by doing 1 year before becoming a head coach the year after that. And the Saints could potentially have a head coach opening depending upon how 2024 goes for Dennis Allen and the team. So for the Saints, they do have a little something that they can offer and a veteran quarterback and all these other things. But perhaps working with a friend and all of the different exciting things that friend could sell. We're going to go after Justin Fields. We're going to trade up. We're going to go get Jaden Daniels. Sell. Probably a lot more appealing than what the New Orleans Saints have to offer if we're being honest here. So for all of that, and after all of this, the New Orleans Saints could potentially see a third candidate that they've interviewed end up heading somewhere else because of something they don't control. They couldn't control Dan Pitcher wanting to stay in Cincinnati where he already had an opportunity and he had an immediate opportunity to move up to offensive coordinator. They couldn't control the fact that the Chicago Bears have the number 1 overall pick. And so Shane Waldron said yes to the Chicago Chicago Bears. And so you have no control over all that. So the only thing you can sit back and say is sad day. Sad day for the New Orleans Saints and their offensive coordinator search. Now, it's not all done here. Okay, they could still get one of these candidates, these good candidates like a Zac Robinson, to say yes. And even if Zac Robinson doesn't say yes, remember, there's still a 1B on that list and a Clint Kubiak. There's still good candidates on that list, including an in-house guy like Ronald Curry, which probably wouldn't be as exciting as a Zac Robinson coming over immediately from Sean McVay's offense. I get that. A lot of people like the opportunity for a potential Bob Greasy hire, right? Like that's another one that people like a ton. And I don't blame them for it. He's low on my list because Brian Greasy, not Bob Greasy. Brian Greasy hire, and he's lower on my list because he just simply doesn't have a lot of experience, not even just as a play caller, but he's only been a quarterback coach for 2 seasons. But look, 9 years of quarterback experience in the NFL, 10 years of quarterback experience in the NFL, maybe that goes a long way there too. So there's still candidates, and let's not forget one of the other top candidates, number 2 on our Locked On Saints coordinator rankings, Gerard Johnson, the quarterback coach for the Houston Texans. So there's still candidates out there, even if they don't get Zac Robinson. But there's no doubt that losing out on Zac Robinson means you're losing out on one of the hottest offensive coordinator potential names or candidates out there. And do you want to do that? No, right? You would love to land the biggest, brightest name. And I certainly would love that for New Orleans. I would love that for you because you would see a very fun offense in New Orleans. But there's still opportunities to find that with guys like Clint Kubiak, guys like Gerard Johnson. Maybe a couple of lingering question marks over both of those guys. Gerard Johnson a little bit, probably has just about as much experience as a Zac Robinson, but isn't coming immediately from Sean McVay, isn't coming immediately from Kyle Shanahan. So how much did he learn from Frank Reich? How much did he learn working with a Kevin O'Connell, who is a guy that was working immediately with a Sean McVay? How much does he learn from a Bobby Slowick, from a DeMeco Ryans in terms of what that offense should look like? And what does his version of that offense look like? That all ends up being a big part of it. So the thing that I look at is it could become very challenging for New Orleans to land their top corner, or I don't want to call them their top candidate, but one of the top candidates. But there are still other top candidates that are available to New Orleans. So we'll see which way they end up going with it. But certainly things did get a lot more complicated thanks to some of the hirings in the NFC South. Now, how much do the hirings in the NFC South complicate the New Orleans Saints 2024 season? Let's break that down as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This segment is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp Therapy Online has been awesome for me. I know that they can be awesome for you as well, because look, sometimes we all need an opportunity to get something off of our chest, big or small. Certain things can easily begin to eat away at you, get to you, things like that. And it's important to let that out, especially to somebody that's an unbiased party in your life. So today I want to share something with you, tell you how I'm feeling, that you might also be feeling as well about the same thing from this week. I kind of hate it that the Atlanta Falcons could potentially end up with the offensive coordinator that I think is the best candidate for the New Orleans Saints. It's purely selfish, and I hate it. I very, very much dislike it, and I don't want that to end up being the reality, but it very well might be. And you know what? I'm just going to have to cope with that. Now, of course, look, therapy can look different for everybody. I'm talking about my favorite sports team here, but there's always bigger problems than your favorite sports team, right? So it's important that you get those things off of your chest every once in a while. So if you're thinking about starting therapy, try BetterHelp today. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Today's episode of Locked On Saints also brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, where you can go to make every moment more. Right now, the Kansas City Chiefs 3.5-point underdogs against the Baltimore Ravens, the Detroit Lions, and their former New Orleans Saints staff over there. Chauncey Gardner-Johnson balling out there as well. 7-point underdogs to the San Francisco 49ers. If you like either one of those heavy underdogs and you've never used FanDuel before, this is the perfect time to get started. Because if you're a new customer right now, you're going to get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. So you can bet on a heavy underdog like that. And even if you lose, win or lose, you get that $150 in bonus bets that you can use for live game parlays. You can also look for other parlays in the Parlay Hub to find the most popular ones available and much more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, family, the NFC South has 2 new coaches. Should Saints fans be concerned about them? Let's break it all down as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Appreciate you very much for being in every day or here on the show. Don't forget to go and check out the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 YouTube stream, the first of its kind on YouTube when it comes to national sports media. Go and check them out today at Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe. All right, so let's take a look at the 2 new hires in the NFC South. Starting off with Dave Canales. He was the former quarterback coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, former offensive coordinator for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, quarterback coach working over with Seattle as well, has done some fantastic things with Geno Smith as well as Baker Mayfield last year. Now all of a sudden he gets the opportunity to be able to step in as the head coach for the Carolina Panthers. Now this is a very, very quick ascension for a Dave Canales. Like I mentioned, just coming over from Seattle, did some really nice things in 2022 with Geno Smith, kind of helped revitalize that career, comeback player of the year that year. Now this past year in 2023 is the offensive coordinator, first-time play caller in Tampa, did some really nice things with Baker Mayfield. Baker Mayfield now a finalist for comeback player of the year, as AP released earlier on Thursday. So you can kind of see what it is that the Carolina Panthers want here. They want their young quarterback, Bryce Young, to develop. And they want him to develop quickly because all of their near future, all the picks that they traded away, the cap space that they're having to kind of figure out and all these other things, there's a lot that's kind of funneled in through Bryce Young, that Bryce Young and his success and his development is effectively definitive or indicative of the Carolina Panthers' success and their ability to move forward as well. So you go out and you get a Dave Canales, a guy that's been able to resurrect the careers of some of these guys, or not necessarily resurrect them, but really give kind of like a second phase to a couple of guys. Like Baker Mayfield is probably going to get a $30 to $40 million contract this offseason. Geno Smith got a second year with the Seattle Seahawks as the starter, all that. I think that those things you're going to see kind of be the things that were circled on the whiteboard when they were breaking down the pros and cons of the potential head coaches that they could hire in Carolina, right? They want that development. Now, the thing about it is that Bryce Young lacks the tools that a Baker Mayfield has. Bryce Young lacks the tools that a Geno Smith has, both of which from a physical level, but also from what seems like a mental processing level as well. That was a big issue for Bryce Young during his rookie season. And then the other piece of it too is you just don't really see David Tepper, right? Like everything for me around what gives me concern around the Carolina Panthers all centers around their owner, David Tepper, who has fired several different coaches between the NFL team, the Carolina Panthers that he owns, and the MLS team that he owns. He just doesn't seem to have the patience. So you're bringing in a guy to develop your young rookie quarterback or your young second-year quarterback in this case. But are you going to have the patience to let that happen properly? Or are you going to continue to be as impatient as a David Tepper has been since he's been the owner of the Carolina Panthers, and then not really provide the opportunity necessary for a Dave Canales to have the impact on a Bryce Young? Yes, Canales had a great impact immediately on Geno Smith, but Geno Smith had years and years of NFL experience before that. Same thing with Baker Mayfield. Had a fantastic first year impact on Baker Mayfield, But Baker Mayfield had a ton of NFL experience before then, bounced around from Chicago to Carolina to Los Angeles, worked with Sean McVay, then showed up in Tampa. I'm not taking away from what Dave Canales did, but what I'm saying is that these guys had a little bit of a warm-up period before they landed with Canales. Bryce Young will not. Bryce Young simply is who he is right now, which was not very promising in 2023. So is he going to be the guy that, Dave Canales can actually get that first year impact out of? So what I think about this for Saints fans is that really this is a hire about Bryce Young and the development of the quarterback. This is not a hire about immediately competing within the NFC South. Could they compete in the NFC South? For sure. The NFC South's going to be trash again in 2024. There's going to be real opportunity there no matter what. It's going to be a bad division. So yeah, Carolina has the ability to compete, but are they going to have the patience that they need to have the long-lasting impact to not only compete in 2024, but create sustainable success moving forward? That's going to be the David Tepper problem and the David Tepper question. Let's take a look at the next hire, which was the Atlanta Falcons hiring Raheem Morris. Now, what this means right off the bat is that Bill Belichick is not in the NFC South. So the Saints don't have to deal with that. At this moment, I would say Bill Belichick probably doesn't coach in 2024, which is kind of wild to consider, but Washington's job is open. Seattle's job is open, neither of which feel like Bill Belichick's a real runner in either of those situations. And we're going to break down how that impacts New Orleans here in a little bit. But no Bill Belichick, that's some good news. The tough part is that Raheem Morris, still a good coach. He got a 10-6 season with Jameis Winston back in 2010, has gone and now worked with a bunch of different teams, including the Los Angeles Rams. Yes, he was a defensive coordinator there, but he saw what a good offense looks like. He understands the bones of a very, very good offense and what that needs to look like, has the defensive mind to be able to support that as well. And I think that those things go a long way. I think Raheem Morris is a coach that Saints fans should not sleep on in terms of the impact that he could have, perhaps in conjunction with a Zac Robinson as his potential offensive coordinator in Atlanta. I think that this is a solid hire for Atlanta and therefore concerning news for the New Orleans Saints and for New Orleans Saints fans. They went about the culture, right? They didn't go to try to imagine Bill Belichick walking the streets of Atlanta. It doesn't make sense. There's not a fit there, right? The city of Atlanta, Bill Belichick, that's not representative. But then you bring in a guy like Raheem Morris, who's a good culture builder, who's a good relationship builder, who's a player's coach, who knows not only the defensive side of the ball extremely well, but has worked in some prolific offenses, can bring that knowledge in terms of what he wants that offense to look like as the guy that sets the tone there, bring somebody in to effectively be the head coach of the offense, very similar to what New Orleans is looking to do over on their offensive side of the football as well. But Atlanta might have just made the right hire, even though it wasn't Bill Belichick. So that's the one that I'm actually a little bit more concerned about. And that's the one that I think Saints fans should actually be a little bit more concerned about. I wouldn't sleep on Raheem Morris. I wouldn't take a look and focus too much on the troubles that he had in Tampa. I think the thing that you're looking at is a brand new coach in Raheem Morris. That's over 10 years ago now, right? He's an entirely new coach at this point. And I think that that's going to be the one hire that's going to give the New Orleans Saints potentially headaches throughout the 2024 season, especially if he lands Zac Robinson, especially if he gets the offensive coordinator that the Saints could have gotten, should have gotten, would have gotten potentially otherwise. That to me is going to be a big time headache for New Orleans, and it's going to make Atlanta competitive. The only thing that's going to get in the way of Atlanta is that, there is something about that franchise, and we'll see what happens with their quarterback and all that. They have to make the right decision at quarterback. But man, out of these two hires and out of the changes that are happening in the NFC South, that right there, the Raheem Morris hire is the one that concerns me the most for the future of the New Orleans Saints. They have to get this offensive coordinator hire right. The New Orleans Saints do. They 100% cannot mess this up because it's not going to be easy winning within a division that's ready to cannibalize itself. Again, this division's probably not going to be good. You might have a single-digit win season winner of the division. Again, maybe a 10-win team in this division, but this division is going to beat the crap out of itself in 2024. And it just got a lot harder with Raheem Morris taking over and all the improvements that he has made as the head coach. So I'm worried. I'm worried for the New Orleans Saints. And it all starts with getting the offensive coordinator hire right. I might feel a lot better once they finally get that done, even though I don't expect that to be soon. So if the Saints want to get this hire right, they've already interviewed and started talking to 8 different candidates. 2, potentially 3 are off the board. So should they add more names? I think the answer is yes, but let's discuss who they should add to that list as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the easiest and most fun way to play daily fantasy sports, the only way that I would ever agree to play daily fantasy football anymore. I don't want to deal with the mystery lineups, the spreadsheet wizards, all that stuff. I want to rely on my football knowledge, and that's what PrizePicks allows you to do. It's you and your knowledge versus the house and their projections. You pick 2 to 6 players. They'll give you a stat projection for that player, whether it's NFL, NBA, MLB, whatever it is that you're looking for. They've got it all. And you just choose whether or not that player is going to come in at more or less than that projection from PrizePicks. And if you get them right, you can win up to 25 times your entry by doing it. It's the best way to play daily fantasy sports. So go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL, enter the promo code LockedOnNFL, and you're going to get a first deposit match up to $100. It's a first deposit match up to $100 by going to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and using the promo code in all lowercase LockedOnNFL. PrizePicks, daily fantasy sports made easy. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. This offensive coordinator hire is the most important coaching staff move the New Orleans Saints have made in the last 3 years, or in the last 3 off seasons, let's say. And because of that, they 100% need to expand their already extensive search if they want to be successful. I appreciate you very much for being here with us. Don't forget, we are your team every day. So we'll be back on Monday at the latest with our mock draft Monday. It'll also be my first day in Mobile with the Senior Bowl as well. We'll be there all week. And so all week throughout, we're going to keep you up to date with everything going on with the offensive coordinator search. We'll talk about the Senior Bowl's importance to the offensive coordinator search here in just a moment, how you can keep up with that even quicker than this show, but also keeping you up to date on the prospects that stand out, all that good stuff. And then if there's any movement or any big news over the course of the weekend, we'll be right back here with you, to get you started. They pay me to talk. Can you believe it? Appreciate you very much for being here. All right, so let's take a look at why I'm talking about this, right? So the Saints right now have had 2 of their 8 interviewed candidates for offensive coordinator go elsewhere, both of which, as I mentioned before, outside of the Saints' control. Dan Pitcher staying in Cincinnati, Shane Waldron going to where he's very likely to be able to work with Caleb Williams, for instance. And then now there's sort of this other one that hangs in limbo when it comes to Zac Robinson. ESPN's Adam Schefter tweeting out earlier today, or posting earlier today, whatever, that look, he's going to be a favorite for the Atlanta Falcons offensive coordinator spot. Zac Robinson will be. And however, despite that, Raheem Morris is going to look at other candidates, right? Like everybody's going to continue to do their searches and things like that. There were 11, there were 12, then 2 got filled, and then 1 offensive coordinator spot just opened up because of the Canales hire opening up the Tampa Bay spot. You've got 11 open offensive coordinator spots right now, and you've got more than that when it comes to candidates. The Saints have spoke to 8, right? And they've got good potential hires if they miss out on a Zac Robinson, a Gerard Johnson, a Clint Kubiak. Those guys were also ranked highly. As I've been mentioning over and over again, Zac Robinson was my 1A. Clint Kubiak was my 1B. Yes, those letters are intentional, AB, but Gerard Johnson was my number 2. You know what I mean? So like the Saints can still find good candidates out of all this, but I do think that expanding their search will be helpful in case those guys go elsewhere, or in case those guys don't want the job and they want to remain where they are, whatever it might be. You just can't be the New Orleans Saints and sit there and fall back on a Mike Sullivan, right? Like you can't let that happen. And even if you fall back on a Ronald Curry, you'd still be pretty fine with that. Then all of a sudden you start looking at, a guy like Brian Griese and say, hey, I know you're the quarterback coach over there, but Clint Kubiak's staying as the passing game coordinator. Why don't you come over here to New Orleans? Quarterback coach and passing game coordinator, both positions are open because they just elevated Ronald Curry. Come be the quarterback coach and passing game coordinator, and we'll talk about next year, or we'll talk about the year after that, or whatever it might be. Like, get the experience that you need, yada, yada, yada. So there's a lot of opportunity. still for the Saints out there, but they could still be doing more. So let's take a look at some of the other names that could potentially end up on this interview list. I want to start off with two big names, guys that we didn't even consider being a part of the offensive coordinator search because it seems so likely that if they were heading anywhere else, it would be because of a head coaching search. Let's start with Los Angeles Chargers offensive coordinator Kellen Moore, former OC over with the Dallas Cowboys. Now, this was his first sort of foray into play calling. Things didn't go as well in Los Angeles with the Chargers as we thought that they might. Brandon Staley was a big part of that, but there were also some failures over on the offensive side of the football. So you have to figure out what a Kellen Moore learned or what stood in Kellen Moore's way and how you might be able to alleviate that or mitigate that in terms of his ability to progress in your system with your quarterback and with the freedom and autonomy that you get over on the offensive side of the football. I really like the way that Jeff Duncan mentioned it over in the NOLA Insiders podcast when he talked about how the Saints are effectively hiring an offensive head coach. I like that viewpoint because you really do have the autonomy of a guy that just sits in and says, okay, plop in, here's your offense. Like Dennis Allen's not going to mess with that. Dennis Allen's going to have some game day things in terms of when do we go for it on fourth down and those types of little things that he's got to make a decision about for the Saints team as a whole. But in terms of play calling, in terms of play design, all those other things like that comes down to the offensive coordinator. And so does not having someone in his way potentially, or somebody that maybe can make some better decisions than Brandon Staley was making, end up potentially benefiting a guy like Kellen Moore and make him maybe a better fit because you saw the success that he had in Dallas, just working as an architect of the offense and things like that. You can trust the design portion of it. Can you trust the play calling portion of it? Another guy, and by the way, the reason why Kellen Moore comes on this list now is because the Chargers just hired Jim Harbaugh. And so when they hire Jim Harbaugh, they've given Kellen Moore now the opportunity to go out and speak to other teams about other offensive coordinator opportunities. So he's now on the market because of that. So something to watch out for. They're not moving on from him because they don't like him. They're not moving on from him because he failed. They're moving on from him because you got a new head coach in the building, and that new head coach is very likely to have an idea of what it is that he wants his own staff to look like. So Kellen Moore could be looking for another opportunity. The Saints could be that opportunity. Another one that we thought was going to be a shoo-in for head coaching spots this offseason is Brian Johnson, the offensive coordinator, former quarterback coach for the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, we all saw the Philadelphia Eagles fall flat on their face, especially on the offensive side, all throughout after starting 10-1. And we have to acknowledge that the Saints don't have a Jalen Hurts, right? They don't have that type of quarterback. So if that style of quarterback is important to Brian Johnson, then the Saints are not going to be a good fit. That's why I always say you don't just interview candidates, but candidates interview you too. So can you provide that candidate with the style of personnel that complements what it is that they do well? So not returning to Philadelphia, we already know that that's what's happening. Nick Sirianni moved on from both coordinators. The defensive side probably had to be the easiest decision ever. But now because of that, Brian Johnson is not getting some of the head coaching looks that we thought, because the only two positions that are still open now are Washington, who haven't interviewed him, and they seem not haven't interviewed him, but they seem locked in on Ben Johnson, the Lions offensive coordinator. Meanwhile, Seattle is the only other head coaching job that's presently open, and they haven't interviewed Brian Johnson. They've looked at guys like Dan Quinn, who was set to interview on Thursday, and then some other candidates that are around that we'll talk about here in just a moment. So a guy like Brian Johnson could potentially be somebody that you say, okay, so what was it that was holding you back? Were you under the thumb of Nick Sirianni? Was Sirianni overruling you? Was he changing things? Stuff like that. Like, start to learn all that stuff. And then if nothing else, by expanding your interview pool more, which I think the Saints have done a good job. Like, they've done a good job with a very extensive and eclectic candidate group, right? 8 different candidates for an offensive coordinator spot. Only 2 of them have been hired away so far. Things are going fine for New Orleans, but they should expand it even more. Every time that you interview somebody new, you learn something about the guys that you've already interviewed. So even if a Kellen Moore comes in and you're like, that's not really what we're looking for, but the why of what you're not looking for gives you an idea of what it is that indeed you are looking for. And oh, wait, Gerard Johnson maybe checks a couple of extra boxes that we weren't thinking about before. Like, there's value in that extensive search. It doesn't just inform you about the person that you are interviewing, it informs you about everyone that you're seeing and that you're considering. So now you also have, with those 2 head coaching spots open, Washington, which seems, like I said, focused in on Ben Johnson, the Lions OC. And then Seattle's probably going to hire Dan Quinn. They're gonna kind of do their own little, backsliding over there and go back to Dan Quinn or go back to a guy that they've worked with before. But Mike McDonald, the Baltimore Ravens defensive coordinator, as Ejiro Everifor has been a guy that they've talked to already as well. The only offensive coordinator type that they've talked to is Mike Kafka, the New York Giants offensive coordinator, which have a blast with that. But what I mean to say here is that once those head coaching spots are filled, you're going to see a lot more of these offensive coordinator types become available because they're not being looked at for some of these other jobs anymore. And then the head coaches take their jobs, and then some of those other, spots, they move on from some of those offensive coordinators because it's not the team that they want to work with. And then the playoff guys, finish up, and then that ends up opening up another pool as well. So there's still a lot of opportunity out there, but the Saints have to get this hire right. They have to get this hire right over in the offensive coordinator spot. And the best way to do that is to continue to expand the pool, which I do think the New Orleans Saints should do. All right. Real quick, I've had a couple more people who have asked me about merch. I've had a couple more people who have asked me about donating to the show. So I just want to highlight this real quick. If you're interested in doing stuff like that, we don't accept donations for the show. The show will always be free, always be available. That will never be jeopardized. And we don't sell merch. But if you want to support the show a little bit more and get something out of it, I would encourage you to join the Locked On Saints Insider Program. $4.99 a month, 14 days free. You join that, try it out, and then there's no commitment. Then you can make the decision after 14 days. Especially with the Senior Bowl coming up, I'm going to send you every single rumor that comes through, everything that I'm hearing. That's where I'm going to first, not Twitter. I won't have time to record the show while I'm out and about and stuff like that. So everything's going straight to there. So if you're interested in joining that, join subtext.com/LockedOnSaints or text Who Dat to 504-285-7473. That will allow you to join up. You also get access to me, ask me questions, Q&As, as well as film studies, and remember to do them, and things like that as well. So if you want to support the show, that's a way to do it and get something out of it. And I appreciate everybody that's continued to ask that question. If we ever change merch-wise, I 100% promise you will know. I will let you know. I might do a whole episode about it if we end up ever doing that. All right. So I appreciate you very much for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day, every day. We'll be back on Monday, if not sooner. Until then, for your second listen, go and check out Caroline Fitton over at Locked On LSU, as well as, of course, Jake Madison over at Locked On Pelicans. Appreciate you very much for making Locked On Saints part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else or on your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And just Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.